Yes, we are live on YouTube. Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Karwan, the Heritage Exploration Initiative. I'm Ishan Sharma, and today we are hosting, I think, the fifth in the series of Karwan special lectures for 2025. We have had the opportunity of listening to Rana Mitter and Salil Mishra, along with Bhangya Bukhya, uh, before this. And just last night, we had Dr. Mika Natif uh, joining us from George Washington University to talk about women at the Mughal court, images, portraits, and patronages of Hamida Banu Begum. Today, we are moving straight from medieval times to modern. We are taking a leap of faith in history and moving centuries to 1940s. So from the 16th 17th century, we are now in the 20th century, mid 20th century, probably the most dramatic decade in the history of the 20th century. People think it was the 70s, but I think it was the 40s when a lot of things were happening, including the World War. And we have with us Dr. Urvi Khaitan joining us from Harvard University this morning for her, this evening for us, who will be speaking on fighting famine and war, working women in the 1940s India. I'll just read a formal introduction, which is uh, the format that we follow. Dr. Urvi Khaitan is an economic and social historian researching the economics of gender in 20th century South Asia. Her work centers the working lives of women pushed to the margins of society by their gender and socio-economic status, arguing that women's labor, paid or unpaid, is central and structural to the South Asian economy. Her doctoral thesis used the 1940s, a period of economic turbulence marked by the Second World War and the Bengal Famine, and consequently a time of enhanced archival visibility as a lens to explore women's economic agency and activity. And she holds a DPhil and an MPhil in economic and social history from University of Oxford, and a BA in history from my alma mater, Delhi University. Not the same college, a much better college, St. Stephen's in Delhi University. Her work has been supported by University of Oxford, the Institute of Historical Research, and the Royal Historical Society. And she is very much interested in community and public engagement, contrary to a lot of popular historians saying nowadays that historians do not engage with the public. They very much do. And with that note, I welcome Dr. Khaitan. Thank you so much, Urvi, for accepting this invitation. Over to you. You can now share the screen as well.
Thank you so much, Ishan, for that very generous introduction. I'm not used to formality, as I was just telling Ishan, but I am very grateful for your putting my work in context. So I'm going to share my screen right now. Hopefully, you can see that in slideshow mode, if that's correct. Yeah, perfect. All right. So before I begin, actually, I want to give a little bit of a sense of where we how I really use the 1940s. And I know that you've, in the special lecture series, probably spanned centuries and millennia. But here's why I think that this particular decade has such an important um, lens to tell us a bigger story than just contained by time. So, in my work, I focus on people who are pushed to the margins of society. So, people who are marginalized but not necessarily marginal. Uh, People who are numerically the bulk of India's population, so people from lower castes and indigenous Adivasi communities, but who, for a variety of reasons, including caste oppression and discrimination, have not been recorded or given space in the archive on their own terms. Now, what happens is that when there is a moment of turbulence, such as the Second World War and the Bengal Famine in the 1940s, there is suddenly a surge in record keeping. And suddenly the archive is full of literally reams and reams of papers and files and pictures and statistical data on people who don't ordinarily make it in. And so I really come to this presentation and to this talk from that lens is that how do I take a period which is special because of many reasons, but most special because it allows us to see people whom we usually can't see and allows us to read voices that are usually not given a space, a physical space at least, in the archive that historians are so dependent on. So with that, Pradyut, and I'll tell you a little more throughout the presentation as we go ahead. I'll start fighting famine and war, working women in 1940s India. And I use working women quite deliberately here. And I'll start with a little bit of a truism, which is in South Asia, there is no such thing as an idle woman. Certainly, when I grew up, I constantly saw women at work all around me. But it seemed that there wasn't really much of any kind of history or economic history, at least, of women's labor in the subcontinent. And so, as I just described, I use the Second World War as a lens to tell the histories of people who are ordinarily written out of archives. And so, while this might be a marginalized history, it is by no means a marginal history. When we think of the Second World War, and we've inherited largely a history that has been told by Western white historians, and that is changing and has changed considerably in the last 10 to 15 years. And my own supervisor at Oxford, Yasmin Khan, wrote the book, The Rajat War. We also have historians like Srinath Raghavan, who have written about how the Indian subcontinent was entirely reshaped and how its economy was engineered to support the Allied World War effort through the production of commodities, various commodities, but also through the supply of people power. And some of this people power came through the 2.5 million men who served on the British Indian Army and Navy and several other um, sort of policing and armed forces during this period. And there is a certain kind of narrative that that Allied war effort and its propaganda will have us see. So we're given this picture of unity, of this common mission bringing together people from all races and creeds and castes, or so we're made to believe. We also have stories of South Asian women at war. On the left, we have a photo of Second Officer Kalyani Sen, who was an officer in the Women's Royal Indian Naval Service. So, in addition to the male armed forces, there was a Women's Auxiliary Corps, which was started in India to sort of complement similar versions in the US and the UK and elsewhere. And Second Officer Kalyani Sen was brought over to England to meet the Queen, incidentally, when she came um, in when she was serving in the 1940s. And we have all of these photographs of women in these kind of regimental saris who are working as clerks, as sometimes as technical operators, as secretaries, managing supplies, sort of doing the white collar secretarial work that the war implies. But and while that's a very valid history, and we have also fascinating photographs of women carrying stretchers and helping with air raid precaution training, um, that's a history that I'm less interested in for the purposes of today's talk. For the purposes of today's talk, I'm interested in really the poorest of the poor. What happens to people, everyday people, common folk, when they're hit by crisis, and how do they cope with it? We have these propaganda posters hinting at some of these more complicated histories. So here I'm showing you a couple of posters from the Imperial War Museum archives, which display and in some ways commemorate the contributions of women who were working in rubber and tea plantations in India, but across Southeast Asia. And so I will start a little bit with the story of tea because I think it's a cozy story. And we have, again, drawing on photographs because what I do with my work is I really try and pull together visual material with qualitative as well as statistical data. So it's very much like a mixed methods approach to trying to tell history. And so we have a little bit of a cute story that we're being told about the spread of tea around the world in the Second World War. And Erica Rappaport writes about how tea becomes this indispensable wartime beverage. And so they're pictured soldiers across all theaters of war in the Middle East, in Asia, and of course in Europe, who are unified by tea. and factory workers in Britain whose breaks are structured around a caffeinated beverage to supply them more energy, or even East African troops who've been transported to Sri Lanka. And Rappaport writes that this beverage becomes so embedded in the sensual and social understandings of normalcy that its absence becomes construed as this sort of psychologically devastating and a sign of the collapse of civilization. Uh, and this is perhaps not an audience that needs to be told this, but that production of that tea is solely dependent on the labor put in by over 1 million underpaid and underfed laborers, 500,000 of whom are women and children working in Assam, in Bengal, in Sri Lanka, uh, who are suffering from the effects of hyperinflation, food having become extremely expensive and in short supply, and very dependent on whatever rations they are given by their employers. So that's the sort of like stories beneath the surface approach that we're taking here. I'm going to excavate the archive, not take what is given at face value, but really try and get at sort of the who's at the bottom of the supply chain. So if you're looking at a cup of tea, who's actually producing the tea? If we're looking at a tank, who's producing the fuel that's going into the tank? And so that's the sort of kind of almost political commitment to trying to see and trying to tell a history that isn't available immediately to us. But if we do digging, then we can actually bring out these stories of the subaltern right to the surface. So I'll start with this process by thinking about the most turbulent impact of the Second World War in India and the way in which that everyday people in India interacted with the war in its most sort of pernicious form was through food shortage and famine. And famine takes its most extreme form in Bengal in 1943. However, the entire decade of the 1940s is a decade marked by food supply problems. We even have food shortages in Madras, in various pockets in the princely states, erstwhile princely states as well. So this is not a problem that's localized to Bengal. In fact, it's felt quite heavily in the Northeast as well. But to this level of devastation that Bengal faces in 1943 is that it witnesses the death of 3 to 5 million people due to starvation or starvation-related diseases and malnourishment. And Bengal is certainly what captures the imagination of uh, philanthropists and people the world over because of how terrible and how visibly terrible things are then. You see, sometimes you hear these stories of people who have witnessed the Bengal famine. And there are historians who argue that people who experienced the famine did not live to write about it. That the only people who can write about the famine are upper caste, middle class people who were able to, in some ways, work in charitable relief to feed starving people. And so, what we often see is in depictions of the famine constantly is that there's always an image of a starving mother with a child. Um, and what I found when I was looking at this period is that it's strange that women are everywhere in the iconography of the famine, something which has also been pointed out by other historians. But then there's no actual women's history of the famine. So, how are women actually experiencing this in upheaval? Because it's these pictures and these writings are suggesting to me that they actually had a major role to play and were on the front line of this famine. And the simplistic history sort of is that when women were hit by famine, uh, they had to take to prostitution in order to support themselves. Um, and in some ways, that's far too simplistic a story. In that, of course, that might be true, but we haven't really studied the mechanisms by which they end up in these in these positions where they're coerced into such labor. So I did a little digging into the actual data around this. So what you have in front of you is a chart that shows you the number of destitutes in Bengal in May 1944. Now we know that about 10 million people in uh, Bengal were affected by the famine. And at this time, so this is some anthropologists and in fact PC Mahalanobis who got together to undertake a sample survey of the effects of the famine where they studied 386,000 people. And they found that women destitutes in many ways outnumbered male destitutes. And so overall, so red is female and blue is male. And I'd like to draw your attention to this category, this 15 to 50 years category, which is a rather large age category. But over here, we see that the number of women who are destituted meaning rendered completely impoverished, so totally dependent on charity for survival, is double the number of men who are in this position. If we also look at other surveys that look at people who lost their employment, their occupations due to the turbulence of the famine, again, we see that there's a disproportionate effect on women. If we look at sort of agricultural labor, more women lost their agricultural jobs than men. More women were living on charity than men. At this time, there is also an uneven sex ratio in Bengal. So for every 100 men in Bengal, there's 108 women. So thinking about that uneven sex ratio and still these persistently skewed figures where women are outnumbering men in a lot of key areas, is that there's clearly a gendered effect that we can see on the famine. Now, what happened when the famine hit the Bengal countryside is that families decided to try and get to urban centers, to towns in order to get food to survive. And most often, it was mothers who took their children with them on these walks. So they undertook these huge, long, very difficult, very arduous walks. And so these are probably the last of the tables here, but I just wanted to show you now, in the census of Bengal, the most recent census that had been produced at the time, scheduled castes were 5% of the population. However, they accounted for over 40% of the people who were actually destituted and affected by the famine. So that's a huge overrepresentation, which tells you that there are people who are more vulnerable than others. Now, I also think that that number is an underestimation. But because economists always want a number to things, I'm putting that out there. But please consider it an underestimation. And so what we see is that this is a survey of by anthropologists and economists of families who headed towards Calcutta in order to get reach these relief camps. And they found that in 67% of the cases of these families coming, um, they were led by female heads of households. So it wasn't fathers bringing children, it was mothers bringing their children, often without husbands. Um, and yes, as you will notice, it's mothers heavily outnumbering men in pretty much every category. And especially more so on this, the chart over here is I've put the age group 20 to 50. And this age group is interesting because 20 to 50 is, well, of course, the bulk of a human's life, but it's also the period which is considered to be your working age category. Um, so just to sum up in terms of what I meant about what we're told about the simple sort of women are victims narrative, is that it ignores a longer term history of complex and multi-sectoral women's labor market activity. You know, it denies independent economic agency to women. So by saying that either they were just victims or they were abandoned by wayward husbands, it denies the fact that women as individuals lost their livelihoods. And we have firm empirical proof about this, as I've just shown. And when we say that women had to take to prostitution, it doesn't adequately address the absence of choice in such a market. And we need to analyze the mechanisms by which that choice was taken away from women. So let's think a little bit about behind the data and go to the actual stories. So we'll come to 18-year-old Efal Jan, who is a Muslim woman from Chandpur. Her husband had left her after their only son died very sadly due to malnourishment. And she had nothing left but the clothes on her back. And she found herself at a destitutes relief camp in what is now modern day Bangladesh. And there she was interviewed by a relief worker. And she told the relief worker, I'm no beggar. I want to work for my food. I don't like to stay here. But where would women like Effeljan go? Now, during this period, while the famine was ongoing, in parallel, the Second World War effort for the Allies was stepping up in the subcontinent. So, Japan had been advancing on Burma. The war was about to reach India's eastern and northeastern doorsteps. And what was needed was a massive expansion of Allied operations on the ground in Bengal, Assam, in Burma, as well as certain other parts of India. Now, these allies needed runways from which they would fly planes, which would either ferry supplies over the Himalayas to China, from where they would go on to bomb Japan, or runways from which fighter squadrons would go and bomb the Japanese occupied Burma. So, as a result, this is why the geographical location of these runways. But you needed a massive amount of labor for these operations. And thus began the recruitment of Labor Corps, which was an informally organized, recruited through subcontractors. So it stayed deliberately unregulated body of labor. And this women's labor corps was about estimated to be 30,000. Again, I feel that this is an underestimation by all accounts. But that there were at least tens of thousands of women who were recruited into forming this women's only labor corps. And Frida Bedi, the journalist, writes about this. She says, there is no security of service. And in between bouts of work, there is starvation for them and worse. Few of the women stick to the work for long. Weakness and disease drags them back again to the village and death. Pictured here is we have an image of what one of these air bases would have looked like, and they're dotted around places like near Kharagpur in Kolkata. Sorry, near Kharagpur in Bengal, near Bishnupur. I'll show you some more images as we go. Uh, so we have screen grabs from documentaries that were made at the time of women transporting barrels of petroleum. So this is from a film called China Lifeline, where we trace the journey of this oil ship from Texas all the way to Calcutta, from where these women take the oil off the ships, and this ultimately ends up in China and then eventually is used in the war effort being prosecuted against Japan. Um, but more often, we see images like these. So this is an image from the airfield near Kharagpur, and this was sort of given to the Associated Press to publicize. And we see a line of women-only gangs carrying these baskets on their heads. They're all dressed sort of exactly the same, saris hitched up to their knees. You'll notice they're all barefoot. Of course, in this picture, which has likely been staged, the baskets are empty, but they would have otherwise been carrying extremely heavy pieces, heavy loads of stone. So this particular photograph is captioned "The Old and the New." These native Indian women carrying baskets on their heads, representing one of the oldest forms of transportation, march past a B-29 Superfortress. So there is a juxtaposition of the old and the new, so sort of the primitive and the modern that is being asserted here. And we see women involved in every single step of runway construction. So this is just a selection of photographs, but this is the actual process of the transformation of rice fields. So they were dredged, they were dried, and then they were turned into these massive runways. Um, Here we see women unloading crushed stone from the back of a truck. And what I really like about this particular photograph is that there are hardly any men to be seen. The only men you see have their backs to the camera. And in some areas, you can also see toddlers running around in the background or children with their mothers. This really turns the idea of a military camp, traditionally assumed to be a pretty hyper masculine space, totally on its head. Here we see women pounding rocks to make gravel to line the runways. And this set of photographs is actually drawn from the US National Archives because the US joined the British war effort in a significant way in India, 1942 and onwards, and actually undertook a lot of the runway and road construction. These two photographs are slightly different from the others in that they focus more on the actual women as subjects of the photographs. And I'll just draw your attention quickly to this photograph where you can really sort of see the physical effort that this process needs. And also because of the contrast, and I don't know how well you can see this, but of the men in the background who are suited and booted, and the women who are barefoot and without any personal protective equipment. This is also in a similar vein of sort of iconic images that were taken, uh, again, women walking past a modern airplane. So I want to switch tack a little bit, and before I do, I just want to issue a trigger warning. There'll be brief references to sexual violence that follow. But as I said, this is really about excavating for histories that lie beneath the surface. So it's taking these photographs and then trying to think about the actual experiences of the women somewhat on their own terms and as close as we can get to how they describe their own experiences of working in these very multicultural, cosmopolitan spaces. So we'll go to another part of Bengal. We'll go to Cox's Bazar, which is incidentally the area which has one of the largest Rohingya refugee camps in the world right now. So it's right next to the border with Burma in modern day Bangladesh. So in Cox's Bazar, this was an area which was really sort of at the tip of the British sort of plan to re-enter Burma and win it back from the Japanese. So this was a area that was crowded with men, with soldiers from West Africa, from Britain, from the United States, from India, who had all come and turned this into really a multinational hotspot. Uh, and Cox's Bazar became a destination also for many poor women, men, and children who were looking desperately for an income earning opportunity. So we hear here from an unnamed girl, she remains unnamed in the archive, who was in her mid-teens, and she was interviewed by a Communist Party worker who had been sent to Cox's Bazar to see what the situation was there. And she tells him, he sold me to a military man for 500. My body costs 500 rupees. When he dies, God will take those 500 rupees from his flesh. Tell me, is God just? Won't he torture my brother in his grave for selling his sister? End quote. Uh, Now, this girl uh, described her experiences of having lost her parents and her cousin, the brother referred to here, sold her for a sum of 500 rupees. Uh, this quote, which was one of the first I came across in the archives, hints at this network of the sale of women for their labor. And the more I dug, the more I found reports of what the newspapers call boatloads of human cargo being sent around the water network in Bengal of destitute women, girls who were sold by their families, rarely ever for a sum like that. I think that is an exaggeration, but the prices could be 27 annas, 11 annas, maybe up to a rupee. Um, but these women who were sold by their families ended up being sent off by military subcontractors in trucks to various depots where they essentially worked both in building these roads and runways by day, but by night they were often coerced into providing sexual services to this multinational clientele of soldiers. So it's a very difficult and it's a very, this is a story of exploitation. Despite the sort of narrative or propaganda narrative that the actual Allied war effort stuff will have you say, is that these are not easy stories. And similar reports had a 10-year-old witness named Suleiman explicitly talking about um, how these women were treated by the soldiers around them. And I'll just go back quickly to that unnamed teenage girl who goes on to describe the horrors of a military truck and the post traumatic stress and uh, effects on her mental health are very visible because of her immediate reaction when she does see a military truck that comes upon them while she is being interviewed. So, the Labour Corps is more than just a story of international cooperation, of an all hands on deck approach to the war effort. It's also a story of how women are especially vulnerable in times of crisis and economic turbulence. They cannot command the same wages as men because they are underpaid, and that there are all of these asymmetries of power which force them and coerce them into positions like these. But and I'll also share Cheheru's story, who was a 22-year-old uh, contractor in the Women's Labor Corps, who herself ended up becoming a boss, or sort of a supervisor of her own staff. And so she had lost her family during the famine and subsequent epidemics, but managed to find her way to Cox's Bazar, where she joined the Labor Corps. And she ended up becoming um, a supplier of women to the Corps in her own right. And so we have the Communist Party worker writing about her, saying she became a pimp. She became powerful with the support of the sahibs and started wearing high heel shoes and a wristwatch. She could move about with a stick in her hand. She insulted anyone she liked. End quote. So this is Cheru's story, not in her own words. Often, when people wrote about these women, they wrote about them very judgmentally, in a very patronizing way, without understanding the depth of their engagement with the labor market, how they were affected when the famine occurred, and therefore the decisions that they had to make for survival when it came to it. So women often turn up in the archive not on their own terms, but because of the ways that in which they are policed. And in the Second World War archive, a big way that they show up is through the threat of venereal disease. Because the last thing that these Allied commands wanted was for their soldiers um, to land up with sexually transmitted diseases, which then would land them inactive. So we also have a number of posters and guidance and efforts to control. But if anything, the degree and the volume of correspondence shows that these were lines that were constantly transgressed. And so it's very hard to understand how a sphere in which agency is so vulnerable to coercion um, is operating against this larger background of the desperate need for survival. So this is an example which I think is relevant far beyond just the Second World War, because it tells you a little bit, suggests the difficulties of having to operate when food is expensive, when inflation is high, when you just need to make sure that your child is able to make it to the next day, and the decisions that one makes then. Another way in which women turn up in the archive, in the Second World War archive, is through their work in coal mines. And I'll just spend a few minutes on this story as we sort of also approach the last 10 minutes of my talk. Is that as I mentioned, don't think there's really an inherited history of women at work in the Indian subcontinent. We have historians like Samita Sen, who's looked at women's work in the jute industry. We have Kuntala Lahiri Dutt, who has looked at the gendering of mining spaces. But in general, the 20th century seems to be a decade of exclusion of women from income earning opportunities. That there are a series of protective labor laws which are enacted by the government, which makes women less attractive to employers, and they sort of retreat into the home, uh, or so the expectation is. However, mining areas in Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa, and what is now Madhya Pradesh, continue to be some of the most deprived and disadvantaged areas in India today. There are very few income earning opportunities other than working in coal mines or working illegally in rat trap mines in these areas, which are so geared towards extractive industry that there are really no other ways to earn incomes. So have here two photographs, one from 1927 and one from 2016. And they have an eerie resemblance to each other. They both show women carrying baskets laden with coal up these slopes, And they're both taken in the Jharia coal fields, which has a 100-year-old fire that's constantly been raging and blazing underground. Uh, Now, I bring this story up because around the 1920s, there was a big debate raging about whether or not women should be allowed to go underground to mine coal in India. Now, in Britain, in 1842, women had been banned from working underground. And only Russia, Japan, and India allowed women to work below the surface. Now, this sort of became the metaphor for the exploitation of women by industry in the eyes of observers everywhere from London to Delhi. And then, after a large amount of pressure, these women who were employed as loaders, so in this job in carrying coal from that had been cut up to the surface, as well as a lot of other sort of what was labeled unskilled manual labor jobs. A decision was made in the late 1930s to ban women from working underground any further. And India, in fact, promulgated a convention at the International Labour Organization, the ILO, to say that women shall no longer work underground, and a number of countries became signatories to it. Now, 6 short years later, it's 1943, we're in the middle of a famine, we're in the middle of the Second World War. India owes a ton of coal to the British. Out of the 25.5 million tons that they have promised, there is a 6 million ton shortage that is feared. And so, what else does the colonial government do but reverse its commitments and bring women back into working in mines? Now, this leads to a tremendous amount of outrage. So, everywhere from the Christian Action Fellowship in London to a concerned individual, Mrs. Wright, who lives in Highgate in London, to a Derby and District Trades Councils, a number of unions across Britain, as the All India Women's Conference in India, which declares Mines Day to be observed all across the country, they all begin writing to the colonial government, including the National Council of Women in India, which writes to the Queen, urging her intervention in trying to sort out this issue. Because in their eyes, how could women who are wives and mothers be expected to work underground and face such terrible conditions? They argue that this is not the principles upon which the war is being fought. Now, this is a more complicated story, as usual, as I'm sure you would have figured out in the vein of this presentation. So, of course, life in a coal mine is very difficult. And we have accounts such as this oral a history song that was translated by the historian Dheeraj Nite, who talks about how hard the loader's life is and how difficult it is for his wife, and how there are other threats to their bodily autonomy that they face in coal mines. But we're also missing the story that this is the time of the Bengal famine. And as I said, the famine was not restricted to just Bengal, but food shortage affected Eastern India across the board. During this time, um, there were 77,000 odd women who were working below and above ground in coal mines. This was an increase from only 20,000 before the ban was lifted. So, sort of between 1944 and 1946, there's an increase by over 50,000 of the number of women who are working. And this is work that the Viceroy's Executive Council reports saves the situation. Because not only is India able to deliver its coal targets to Britain for the war effort, it's because these women alone are there, they save up to 385,000 tons of coal per month during the 2 years that they work underground. This was far from insignificant. In fact, men and women were paid the same amount, and women were actually paid higher wages for the same job during this period, which is something that's absolutely unimaginable at any other point, which really shows that there is this reliance of the colonial state on the labor put in by women specifically. Um, and here we have these images of from 1945, which was secretly taken. Um, I mean, of course, the miners knew that the image was being taken, but these photos were kept top secret until I found them in a small little envelope in the British Library, where we see miners captured underground. Now, on the photograph on the left, you'll notice that it's a very small um, mine. So this is less than 4 feet high. And the women are standing only because they're standing in a trench that has been dug into the ground. One of the commitments that India had made, that the British government, British colonial government had made, was that women were not going to work in mines that were less than 5.5 feet high. However, women were very much working in mines that were of a lower depth, lower height than that. Um, and interestingly, the underground, with the constant pressure on the colonial government and the constant criticism that women were being subjected to such conditions, criticism that did not extend to men who were facing the same conditions and who continued to face the same conditions even before and after the ban. In February 1946, the government finally cowed down and decided to reimpose the ban on women's work. This sent 20,000 women totally out of employment who had very little opportunities in the surrounding areas to find more income. So this affected family incomes by over 30 to 35% at least. Um, Not to mention the sort of future trajectories of mining families who were very dependent not on a male breadwinning income, but on both women and male incomes. So I hope this has given you a little bit of a flavor of the variety of strategies that women undertook in order to cope with the effects of displacement, destitution, food shortage. Unfortunately, what happens is that once the war ends, um, and once the sort of immediacy of the famine also slows down, these women disappear from the archive because they're no longer relevant to the colonial state or to relief workers or to middle class charity workers to keep accounts for them. A lot of these people are people who turn up now and again in different ways. So when the Tebhaga peasant uprisings happened in 46, we see some traces. During the partition, we have this wealth of sources, never enough to tell the stories of the poorest of the poor, but at least some visibility. Um, it is despite the many constraints that were placed on women's economic agency, they were actually everywhere. They were everywhere from mines to construction sites. They were building roads, they were building runways, they were standing in queues for relief kitchens. They used a variety of um, actions and agential ways in order to assert their claims to existence, even when it was difficult and exploitative. I want to share and with you that I made a few journeys to some of these abandoned runways. And so here we have a photo from Gushkara in West Bengal, which is very close to Shantiniketan, the university town. It's about half an hour's drive from there. And this is a picture of women who are repairing a road. And a couple of years ago, I went to Gushkara myself. And I've been to a couple of other runways after that, where I found literally cutting through the paddy fields was this 2 kilometer long runway that sort of extended into the distance as far as the eye could see. And around you were paddy fields. There were several women who were continuing to work in the paddy fields, sort of, similar to these women bent down at the waist or bent on their haunches as they worked. And so to end on the note of why does this matter beyond just being a historical story, which, and I, of course, as a historical story, also it matters tremendously. But why should we, why would I like everyone to sit with this for some time? Is because India is somewhat of an exception globally in that even though literacy rates for women have been rising, female labor force participation rates have been falling at best, apart from a few recent improvements due to changes in how women's work is counted. It's a developmental puzzle. Why are women retreating from the workforce when they should have more tools to participate in it? My take on the story is that women are not retreating from the workforce. It is just that more and more women are diverted into informal and exploitative unregulated labor. So what happens to these women who were working in coal mines and in road construction? It's not like these women had never worked before for a wage in their lives. They had always negotiated the economy in some way or the other, whether it was through producing small goods for sale in the market, whether it was working in agricultural labor, whether it was always working in coal mines, but sort of above ground instead of below ground. There is a long and a very complex history of women's labor market activity here. Historians, economists, and social scientists have persistently underestimated how engaged women are with the economy, have persistently undercounted how women often work, because work can sometimes be episodic. It isn't stops and starts because of the constraints of the home. And of course, we haven't accounted for the double burden that women face both as homemakers as well as working women. Uh, and so this is a story that I feel has a lot of relevance because I think it prompts us to really think about um, how work is counted for women, the sorts of jobs that women are forced to take, um, what low skill levels and the opportunity to and the lack of opportunity to upskill means in terms of restricting women, their families, and their children to poverty traps without a second sizable income. Um, and just the sort of constraints that are placed on women's economic agency. So while this is a historical story, there are resonances that are contemporary. And I can tell you for sure that when I was standing in Gushkara on this runway, I had never felt more insignificant as a historian or a researcher as that moment that I was standing on that concrete. Um, with that, I will end.
Thank you so much, Urvi, for that brilliant lecture. I think we'll all have to take a few moments to actually reflect on what you presented today. The wealth of archival material that you kind of have collected over the years. I don't know if it has been used before or not, but has
Um,
it been?
So, I'll not, so the photographs I found totally by accident. Maybe I can give you a little bit of a archival
Yeah.
journey
Yeah.
because I think it might help for historians and budding historians in who might be listening. So, a lot of people have written about the Bengal famine. Okay, like so many people. But as I said, there was no gender history of the famine. And during COVID, it was the depths of COVID, and I was stuck at home and could not go to an archive. And I just spent a lot of time on the internet searching for all sorts of keyword combinations. So, women, war, women, Bengal famine. And suddenly, out of nowhere, I find the US National Archives, whom I'd not even considered before. And I see all of these photographs, the photographs that I showed you of women working in these military bases. And they were shocking because nowhere, no textual record, no statistical table otherwise is going to tell you that they were women there. They were just native labor or they were coolies. You know, there are homogenizing labels that were used. But in front of me, I could only see pictures of women. It was strange because there were hardly any men to be seen. So that was step one. Step two was when I realized that there was clearly a story here. Um, I looked at all of the sources that people and that economists had drawn on for the Bengal famine. So I used the same sets of sources that they use, but even though there was always data that was disaggregated by gender, they never used that data. So I just used in that way, that was quite a simple step. Sometimes it's there, but you just have to kind of make the effort to see if they actually mention women, and they did in big numbers. So part of it is also we come with our own biases and assumptions that women don't exist in the archives, but they're very much there. Sometimes it's a first step, and sometimes it's a two-step querying process that you need to do.
No, that's a very important point that you have made, and I think that will inspire all of us, the young, historians in training who are listening to us or who might listen to us later on, that one has to take that the hard work of going into the archives, looking it up, or sometimes a simple Google search can
Honestly,
give
a
you a
Google
lot
search
of things.
has can show you a lot of things. A lot of this has come about through Google search and search engine optimization. Whoever's working on that at Google, thank you, I guess. You're exploitative, but yeah,
We have
yeah.
three questions in the audience. I'll just read them out for
Hmm.
you. One is from
Yeah.
Harish Mehta. His
Hmm.
question: did any women participate without coercion for
Yeah.
a national cause? Though this
Mhm.
is unlikely, what were Indian women leaders doing about this forced labor? Weren't they raising any voices back then?
Mhm. Great question. So, I think this is in on there's an answer on two sides. One is so women who are voluntarily working for a national cause. So right at the beginning of the talk, I'd shown those pictures of women in the Auxiliary Corps and the Royal Indian Naval Service. So those are probably the best examples that we have of women who joined it out of a sense of actual patriotism, but also it was a job. It provided uniform housing. It was a homosocial space of interaction between white and brown women on a scale that women that they had at least never experienced before. However, that is very much a story for elite women. And so part of what I also sort of argue is that we really need to disaggregate the monolithic category of the Indian woman. Because I think that's sort of been one of the things that has held back women's history in a lot of ways in South Asia, is that we're very reliant on certain kinds of written accounts. But that means we end up privileging the Bhadralok or the middle class or Anglophone writers or educated women. But when you can't do that in the same ways for people who are not literate, uh, such as the women that I focus on, so while I would be hesitant to make a claim on their behalf, since I have the they don't tell me on their own terms that they did not fight for a national cause. My sort of best educated guess would be based on what I've seen is that for them, this is a question of survival. So they may have voluntarily taken to engaging, say, in commercial sexual services for that reason. However, there was still a wider nexus of contractors and pimps that operated that put them in a lower position of bargaining power compared to their clients. So yes, there was probably a degree of choice in some of these, but I think that there was a lot, even when there was that choice, there was a larger nexus that was still putting them in a disadvantaged position.
Thank you so much for your answer to Harish's query. The next query is by Julie Mehta. Her question is: was there a distinction between the manner in which Hindu or Muslim women were treated?
Mhm. Again, that is a very interesting question. And because we have names of some of these women, we can actually tell their religion. So, on sort of one thing is while there was not maybe a change in how they were treated that I have observed, though I think that is like that's definitely one to think about. In some ways, I wonder if the experience of the labor corps was a leveler of experience. In some ways, that it kind of homogenized and led to the collapse of these ethnic and religious differences because of that unifying experience of destitution and displacement. But I would like to like share. So Effeljan, that 18-year-old girl, was a Muslim girl. And then I also have the story of like one explicitly labeled Hindu woman who was Narmada, a Hindu woman named Narmada who was from the Sundarbans, who lost uh, three of her five children in the space of 3 months. Used to have 4 acres of land before the famine, which she lost. Lost her husband and ended up on a railway station platform in Baliganj station in Calcutta looking for food. So, in a sense that I wonder if even they all started at slightly different places and points, they kind of ended up converging in some ways by this effect of poverty and survival. But yeah, I think that's a really good point.
We have two questions from Adil Desai. The first question is: Why was there gender differentiation when working in the coal mines when
Mm.
they can work shoulder to shoulder in factory manufacturing units?
Yeah.
So many different items like high tech cars as well. This
Hmm.
is question. Yeah.
Yeah. I think you have really gotten to like the real nub of the question here is why is there a gender difference in certain types of work? And I think this with coal mines, it's a really great example of how assumptions around a woman's ability and especially Western gendered um, humanitarian thought can come in. So I'll give you a little more detail here. So these women who are working in coal mines were carrying extremely heavy loads of weight. It is not that women were carrying lower loads of weight or than the men that they worked alongside. They were facing exactly the same kinds of conditions. However, when these well-meaning investigators, a lot of whom were from trade union backgrounds in Britain and some trade union backgrounds in India, and the All India Women's Conference went to visit these women and actually interviewed them about their conditions. The women they complained, of course, that the work was harsh, but they said we'd rather work with our husbands because then if we die together. Um, at least we know what's happening. However, there was all of this pressure, which really comes from this elite humanitarianism, charitable discourse, which says, oh, we can't let future mothers and wives be subjected to this kind of work. Their duty should be within the home. Why should they be doing this? So we see a series of regulations being enacted. So the weight that women could carry was limited. This now, just because a regulation exists, kind of tells you that it was because it was constantly being transgressed or not followed before. So they needed to enforce it. In factories as well, women used to work alongside men in a variety of roles in cotton mills and jute mills. So Samita Sen's work is great here, Radha Kumar's work is great here. But there were a number of regulations which said, oh, women can't work at night. We need to provide creches for women. So what happens over the course of the 20th century is at the beginning of the 20th century, women are very cheap to employ for factory and mine owners because they can pay them lower wages. After a series of these regulations, women actually become more expensive to employ because you then have to make sure that there are all of these facilities available. So even though there was no law saying women should not be hired, indirectly mine owners and factory owners decided not to hire women because they said, this is not efficient for us. So it's a difficult situation where the state thinks it's acting well, but it has regressive impacts on women's income earning opportunities.
The last question for the Q&A. No, I think there are two. So we'll take two last questions.
Mhm.
This is again by Adil. Was it only due to the dangerous conditions? This is the continuation of the
Okay, okay.
first. Was it only due to the dangerous conditions in the coal mine which would make it fatal for them and their children, whoever, who would become motherless if something happened to them? Something that you kind of hinted at in the answer. Would you like to answer it?
Yeah, I'll just add that this was very difficult work. This was very little of the underground mining process was mechanized. So and because miners were often barefoot, they contracted hookworm, ringworm disease from walking on the floor. They were not well ventilated. Lung and pulmonary diseases were very frequent. Um, I don't think necessarily it was the case that women were more vulnerable to these diseases than men, but because they appeared more vulnerable in the eyes of this like wider discursive space, that they were singled out for this. And children were also working underground until 1923 when they were banned. But children and young kids above like 12 were definitely working in mines throughout.
There's one question which is tangential, as is mentioned by Yash Bisht. His question is: there is a notion that sexual violence was used extensively by the Imperial Japanese Army compared to the Allies. How true is that?
Yeah, so that there is this literature on comfort women with and a long-standing Korean, so there was Korean women who were used as comfort women by the Japanese army. It's a long-standing issue also. I'm not the best person to speak about that, but I'm sure that there are many more resources that you can consult on this issue. But I will. The general statement is that in many of kinds of military spaces, if not all, there is a definite asymmetry of power relations between men and women, which is kind of reinforced by this structure of how we've come to expect military occupations to be. And so it's not a surprising story that I found these accounts in India. Um, but each in each area they take on their own regional uh, variations and forms.
Yes, for you, we have something coming soon on Caravan. On 12th of February, we are hosting Professor Sandra Wilson from Murdoch University, who will be talking about, she is a specialist of Japanese history. So she is going to talk about problems of justice in war crime trials, allied prosecutions of Japanese suspects 1945 to 1951. I think you can ask the question there, and
Is a
that might
perfect time.
be it's a good segue. Thanks to Yash for his question, so that we could chip in our upcoming lecture on this. But thank you so much, Urvi, for taking up time this morning. The talk explored the often overlooked history of women's labor in India during the World War II. It focused on the, if we can call, the poorest and the most marginalized section of workers. And you used several archival data, from photographs to the personal accounts that you mentioned, which I think, made history more interesting for a lot of us. And this whole idea of looking at the ignored histories, I think, is something that people should take up now. I think it is the time that we start looking at new ideas, new perspectives to look at history, fresher perspectives to look at history. And what you have done is brilliant, and we look forward to a book very soon on this, based on your research, so that we can all learn a lot than one lecture, and host you again to talk about that book in the coming future. Thank you so much for accepting this invitation.
Thank you so much, Ishan, and thank you all for joining and for the great questions. I really appreciate them.
Thank you so much, everybody, for joining in this evening, and morning and afternoon from wherever you are joining. Um, this was the fifth in the series. The next lecture I'll just mention here is on the 9th of February, by Professor Suchetna Chattopadhyay, on life and death. So we are going back in time now to the First World War. From the Second World War, we'll move to the First World War. Life and death in Calcutta during First World War, 1914 to 1918. That's on 9th of February at 6 p.m. India Standard Time. So do tune in, do like the video, share with your friends, comment your questions in the comment section, or if you have any questions for Dr. Khaitan, you can email us to them at carvanheritage@gmail.com. We'll make sure that we forward those queries to her, and she can get back to you via email. Thank you, everybody. Thank you so much, Urvi. Take care, everybody. As I always say, keep reading, keep thinking, keep questioning. That's how you'll keep yourself sane in these insane times. Jai Bhim.